What if all you have learned about the origin of humanity is just a part of history? What if the Bible, yes, the Holy Bible, contains codes, references, and truths that have been deliberately overshadowed over the centuries? Today, let's dive into such a profound, so forbidden mystery that many are afraid to mention it, the Exodus Anunnaki. After all, why are there so many gaps between the ancient texts of the Bible and the archaeological discoveries of ancient Sumerian? Why do figures known as Anunnaki appear prominently on millennial tablets and have their actions echoed in enigmatic passages from Scripture? Would these Sumerian gods have any connection with the children of God mentioned in Genesis? And the most disturbing, why would humanity have been left behind? We are not talking about mythology. We are talking about documents, records, and reports that point to a real event, a heavenly exodus, a deliberate abandonment, the day when higher entities left, leaving, humanity surrendered to chaos, misinformation, and religious control. For years, independent scholars, theologians, and archaeologists have sought for this forbidden truth. But every time she threatens to surface, silence falls. Books are banned, manuscripts ignored. The official narrative remains unshakable. But now it's time to question, to investigate, to confront what was taught with what was hidden. Because if this story is true, and there is strong evidence of what it is, we are talking about the greatest spiritual manipulation in history. And it all starts here, in this video, right now. And what comes next can shake everything you have believed to this day. So, before continuing, I want to invite you to do something that may seem simple, but it has a huge impact. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and especially comment below what you have heard about Anunnaki. Or if this theme is totally new to you, your comment can help build a community that is really looking for the truth, away from blind dogmas and historical manipulations. This content has been designed for those who feel that there is something beyond what has been taught, to those who realize that the signs are everywhere, but few have the courage to face. And maybe, only perhaps, you are among those who have been called to see what so many ignore. Each like, each registration, and each comment is fundamental for this type of content to continue to those who need it. What we are unraveling here is not just an old mystery, it is a key that can reopen the spiritual eyes of many people. And the system doesn't want that to happen. If you feel that there is something wrong with the story that told you, if something inside you vibrates upon hearing about Exodus Anunnaki, spiritual manipulation, and Bible-hidden truths, so it's already part of this journey. Do not watch as an ordinary viewer. Participate, interact, react. Your presence here is more important than you think. And now that you are within this investigation, get ready. What comes below will further deepen the mystery and reveal shocking connections between the spirit world, the old records, and our current reality. When we look at the older records of humanity, especially those of the civilizations of Mesopotamia, we are confronted with a name that echoes for millennia: Anunnaki. These beings are mentioned in numerous old Sumerian clay tablets, written in cuneiform, with surprising details about their origin, appearance, behaviors, and especially their relationship with humans. What is impressive is not only the richness of these descriptions, but the fact that they have emerged thousands of years before any written version of the Hebrew Scriptures. And this is where history begins to intertwine with biblical accounts. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki as those who descended from the earth. They were not just symbols or spiritual metaphors. They were entities with power, physical presence, and authority. With these beings connected to the children of God mentioned in Genesis 6:1-4, the Bible says that God's children saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took women from all they chose. Of these unions were born the Nephilim, described as giants, renowned men, powerful, the brave of antiquity. It is at this point that the veil of traditional religion begins to tremble. After all, who were these children of God? Why were they able to generate a hybrid lineage? And why, shortly after that, God decides to destroy all humanity with the flood, sparing only Noah and his family? Are the reports of the book of Genesis of the same narrative told in the Sumerian tables, but with different names and interpretations adjusted to biblical monotheism? What many scholars outside the traditional religious circles Ionals propose that the Anunnaki were not gods in the spiritual and divine sense as we understand today, but advanced beings, perhaps fallen, angels, perhaps entities of another dimension, which came to Earth at a remote moment of our history. His deeds and influence were so striking that they were eventually worshipped as deities by civilizations that could not understand their true nature. And here comes one of the most disturbing connections. In the Hebrew tradition, the Elohim, a word often translated as God, is also in the plural. Yes, Elohim is a plural word, although the context of the scriptures points to the uniqueness of Yahweh, the true and supreme God. This does not mean that all ancient gods were real, nor that we should reinterpret the Bible as a book of mythological fiction. On the contrary, what is at stake here is the possibility that the sacred texts of the Bible were written in a world where other entities were actively known, seen, and even feared, a world where the other gods really existed, not as creators, but as usurper beings, rebels, who sought to steal the worship that only belongs to Yahweh. This is why throughout the Old Testament we find a constant theme: God ordering that Israel does not bend before other gods, that does not sacrifice to the Baalans, who does not follow the customs of neighboring nations. This was not just a warning against symbolic idolatry. It was a spiritual, literal war against beings who were passing on to gods, and who had a very clear goal: to deceive humanity and divert their worship. If the Anunnaki were these beings, this is what we are, starting to unravel here. Another important detail that few comment: the physical descriptions of these gods on the Sumerian tablets include details such as imposing appearance, different eyes, large size, and even the ability to manipulate the heavens and earth. Coincidence or not, many of the angels described in the Bible, including those who appear in prophetic views, are also described as entities that cause fear and immediate reverence where they go. No wonder every time an angel appears in the Bible, the first thing he says is, "No themes." The problem is that over time these stories were being separated. Christian tradition threw the Anunnaki into the field of mythology, while maintaining angels and demons as exclusively spiritual figures. Already scholars of ancient Mesopotamia often ignore the biblical text, treating it as a literary narrative without factual value. But what if both sources are talking about the same event, the same cosmic exodus, only for different lenses? And what else intrigues us? Why does the Anunnaki account end with the departure of these beings? Why do the latest mentions about them talk about a time when the gods went up to heaven again, leaving humans alone, lost, and without direction? This idea of abandonment resonates with what many spiritual traditions call the fall of man, or the loss of direct communion with the divine. We could be facing the same story told by multiple peoples, a story of a race that descended from heaven, interacted with humans, corrupted them, taught what they should not know, and then abandoned them. The story of an exodus, not people coming out of Egypt, but from entities leaving the earth, the Anunnaki Exodus. And that raises an urgent question: why was this content classified for so long as prohibited? Why is there still resistance today to discuss these connections? Who benefits from our ignorance about the true events that shaped humanity? What if these answers are all there, between Bible lines? The truth is that we are still just starting to excavate this mystery, and what we will reveal below can radically change the way you see scripture, spirituality, and even the very concept of divinity. But before following, I want to actively invite you to participate in this investigation. Right here in the comments, I want the truth. If you have gotten here and feel that you are ready to go beyond the surface, or if you've heard of Anunnaki first, say what you know. What information did you come to you? What doubts do you have? Your comment, your like, and your registration are the fuel that keeps this content alive. Here, we don't accept ready-made answers. We seek the truth. And when we look at the ancient accounts, both the biblical and the extra-biblical, we begin to perceive a line of events that has always been there, but few dared to gather honestly. It is as if pieces of a sacred puzzle had been spread through different cultures, just hoping that someone had the courage to fit them. And one of these fundamental fragments is precisely what many call the Exodus that has not been told, a silent abandonment, one of which left a deep void in the soul of humanity. And I'm not talking here about science fiction or cheap mysticism theories. I have been talking about ancient texts recorded millennia, which narrate a reality that may have been carefully covered. The vigilantes, high-level spiritual beings, originally designated to protect creation, descended to earth and broke a limit imposed by the Creator. These beings clearly appear in the Book of Enoch, a text that, although not canonical for many traditions, was widely respected among early Christians. In it, the vigilantes, also called sentries, take to themselves human wives, teach science, metallurgy, astrology, magic, and wars. Wisdom that, at first glance, could seem useful, but resulted in spiritual corruption and degradation of humanity. And that changes everything, because if these beings were really part of the original angelic creation, assigned to keep the earth and its inhabitants, the moment they decided to transgress was actually the beginning of abandonment. When they sinned, they failed to fulfill their role and dragged with them part of humanity into the abyss of deception. And what happens after that? God himself, according to Enoch's account, and also the clues left in the Bible, judges these beings, imprisons them, and allows the world to face a period of devastation as a consequence of its rebellion. Some scholars believe that the flood of Genesis was a direct response to this moral and spiritual collapse caused by vigilantes. And here comes the question that bothers you deeply. What about humans? Were you warned? Were they prepared? Or were they simply left behind without direction in the middle of a corrupted world? This is the most painful point of this story, because the feeling of spiritual abandonment is not just speculation. She is felt to this day. Humanity lives a constant search for answers, reconnecting with the divine, but stumbles into fragmented ways, distorted doctrines, and religious structures that often hide than they reveal. What if this is not just the result of ignorance? What if it is, yes, the reflection of a real departure, an abrupt match of these beings who at some point walked between us? The idea of Exodus Anunnaki gets a new layer here. It is not just their departure, but the breaking of the connection between the spiritual and the terrene. Humanity, which once had direct access to the sacred, comes to depend on interpretations, oral traditions, and human institutions to try to rebuild this lost link. And the most intriguing thing is that this idea of abandonment repeatedly appears in the scriptures. How many times Israel was warned for turning away from God? How many times have the prophets cried for reconciliation between the people and the Creator? This longing for something that is unable to name, this feeling that we were made for something bigger but we cannot achieve, it may be the spiritual consequence of an abandonment that began with the vigilantes, a rupture that still reverberates in our collective soul. The central point here is to understand that the abandonment did not come from God, but was provoked by the rebellion of those who were in charge of keeping. When vigilantes rebel, and then they are removed or imprisoned, no one is left to protect. And humanity, still immature spiritually, loses its contact with the sacred. He looks at heaven in search of answers, but heaven is silent. It is in this gap that the false gods, the oppressive religious systems, the figures that stand between man and the divine arise. The space that the vigilantes left was filled by usurper, entities and structures that assumed the role of mediators, but with their own intentions, not always aligned with the will of the Creator. And it is precisely this spiritual manipulation that many have not yet realized. When we say that humanity has been left behind, it is not a figure of language. It's a warning, a call, so we can remember what was lost, so that we look at the old records, the Bible, with alert eyes and ask, what exactly happened? Why was there a direct connection and then it is gone? Why do the prophets cry for the return of the divine presence as if it had been removed? What's more, what does this have to do with the time we live in today? The scriptures speak of a time of restoration, reconnection, a new spill of the Spirit. But before restoration, there needs to be understanding. We need to know what we lost, why we lost, and who contributed to it. The vigilantes not only transgressed, they opened the doors to a deep distortion of human spirituality. And understanding this point is crucial to anyone seeking the truth, because if we do not recognize the root of disconnection, we risk content with religious crumbs, while the banquet of spiritual knowledge permanent locked behind the curtains of the story. And you who has come here, Have you ever stopped to think that perhaps the spiritual emptiness you feel at times, this feeling that something is missing, could be the echo of this ancestral abandonment? Have you reflected on the possibility that what you are looking for in religions, leaders, doctrines, maybe can only be filled when we face the truth that was hidden by millennia? If so, write in the comments, "I want to restore this connection." Also write what you feel when listening to these revelations. Have you heard about the vigilantes? Already suspected a collective spiritual abandonment? Your comment will strengthen this community of seekers of truth. And if you haven't left the like yet, do it now. The silence left by the departure of the vigilantes was not just a spiritual vacuum. It was the beginning of a purposeful erasure, a tear in the sacred history that many prefer to ignore, but some old documents insist on preserving. And among these records, none is as direct, as detailed, as bold in its revelations as the Book of Enoch, a text that, curiously, was respected and quoted by ancient spiritual leaders, including authors of the New Testament, but was excluded from the official Bible canon for reasons that were never fully clarified. And perhaps the reason is exactly what we are about to reveal here. The Book of Enoch not only mentions the vigilantes, he names them, describes his actions, and denounces the catastrophic impact of the presence of these beings on earth. On his pages, Enoch, the seventh after Adam, is taken to heaven in divine order to witness the judgment of the fallen angels. There he sees what no other man has seen: the heavenly host revolt, the birth of the giants, the Nephilim, and the corruption that spread as a plague among humans. The text is straightforward. The angels who descended taught men that they were beyond their spiritual maturity. Astrology, magic, seduction, metal manipulation, weapons, mismees. Not only did they violate the divine order, they accelerated the fall of man. These teachings, seen as prohibited, were not just sinful in the moral sense. They broke with God's original plan for the spiritual development of humanity. Divine intent has always been to lead man by a way of light, truly, of direct communion. But these beings diverted this course, offering dangerous shortcuts, powerless power, knowledge without foundation. And here is the point that connects everything. The content of the Book of Enoch is deeply compatible with biblical accounts, especially with Genesis 6, Daniel 4, and even Revelation. The difference is that Enoch is not afraid to name, to report the spiritual backstage of this cosmic rebellion. Why was this book left out? Who decided that this information was too much to be in the hands of the people? What interests were at stake when you chose to keep these revelations silent? The answer can be simple but disturbing, because the Book of Enoch delivers too much. It reveals connections that put the official narrative in check. It exposes a spiritual war that began long before Adam and Eve and continues to this day behind the scenes of reality. He shows that the earth was the scene of a direct intervention of entities that could well be the same Anunnaki described in the Sumerian tables. Glorious appearance beings, but with torpe intentions. Fallen angels disguised as masters, watchers who betrayed their original mission. And here comes the most critical part of all this. If the content of the Book of Enoch is true, and it has been respected for millennia before being silenced, then we are facing a forbidden spiritual code, a map that can lead us back to the pure understanding of the Bible. A path that unravel who the gods mentioned in the ancient texts are, which explains why there are so many similarities between the Sumerian and Hebrew accounts, which shows that the Anunnaki have never really been gods but angels, messengers and warriors, who have diverted and dragged humanity into chaos. It is important to note that in many cultures, beings that came from heaven are always described with power, light, and mastery over the elements. But Enoch was the only one who recorded the spiritual cost of this contact. He was not charmed by the wonders, he understood the risk. And more than that, it was sent to warn the future generation, our generation, what really happened. The text is clear. Enoch writes and seals the book to be revealed in the end times. This means that the content of this book was not for old days, it was for now. For when the mistake became so sophisticated that only the raw truth would have the power to awaken the dormant. And this truth is uncomfortable, because it forces us to admit that we may have built our faith on an incomplete foundation, that the Bible, although perfect in essence, was filtered by human hands that chose what could or could not be revealed. Enoch's book wide the dark side of spirituality, the spiritual dimension that many try to soften or ignore. He says, in all letters, that humanity was affected by forces that did not understand, deceived by beings who presented themselves as guides, but whose actions led to mass destruction, such as the flood. These beings did not disappear. Enoch himself states that his spiritual descendants and his influence would remain for ages. This hits what many today call hidden power structures, entities disguised as light, religious, and political systems that operate in the shadows. All this web starts to make sense when you read Enoch. It all begins to align. The biblical accounts, the Sumerian writings, the fall of angels, the Anunnaki, the disappearance of the vigilantes, the spiritual abandonment. Everything is part of the same narrative line that was broken, censored, hidden. And now, when you start gathering these pieces, the inevitable question arises, is the story that tell us really the full story? Or are we just seeing what we allowed us to see? Do you feel it? This shiver? Does this inner restlessness that says, does this make sense, even if it is disturbing? So write in the comments, I see the pieces fitting. Share what you felt when finding out what Enoch's book really contains. Have you heard of him? Did you already know that he was taken from the Bible? Your comment is the key to keeping this investigation alive. If you haven't left your like yet, this is the moment. And this is exactly where the curtain begins to rip itself more deeply, because to this point, we are facing powerful beings, ancient entities, angels who descended to earth, and humans who, in the face of the manifestation of these forces, had no discernment to understand what was happening. But from now on, we need to enter an even more sacred, more delicate, and more urgent field. Who is Yahweh in this scenario of fake mixtures, mistakes, and gods? Is it just another old entity among the many names cited in ancient texts? Could the God of the Bible be confused with the same gods revered by the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Babylonians? Or is there a true, absolute, eternal God who differs from everything and everyone, and who is being purposely placed on the same level of these others to confuse their faith? The confusion is not new. Since ancient times, God's people have dealt with neighboring civilizations that worshipped multiple deities, each with his dominion, God of thunder, harvest, war, fertility. Meanwhile, Israel received specific and direct orders from a God who did not accept this plurality. You will not have other gods before me. This phrase, written with fire on stone on Mount Sinai, carries more than a simple ethical commandment. She is a spiritual alert. Yahweh, the true creator, the one who is, who was, and who will come, is saying with all the letters, there are others who present themselves as gods, but I am unique, I am distinct, and I do not share my glory with anyone. And then the inevitable question, who were these other gods mentioned? The Bible speaks of them several times. In Hebrew, the terms Elohim or Baal appear in contexts that indicate that other entities were actually being worshipped, entities that demanded sacrifices, which seduced the people with promises of prosperity, who infiltrated the tribes and confused the leaders. And if we look closely, we realize that these entities were not just inventions of the human mind. They had names, practices, symbols, shrines. They required specific rituals and often the type of worship that Yahweh abominated. This is where the mistake becomes more sophisticated, because if the Anunnaki, for example, were real beings, perhaps fallen angels, perhaps spiritual beings of great power, and if they presented themselves as gods to ancient civilizations, it is perfectly plausible that many of these other gods mentioned in scriptures were exactly these beings, real entities with skills that dazzled humans, but whose origin was corrupted. They were aware, technology, they had a glorious appearance, and all this made them objects of worship. But they were not the creator. They weren't Yahweh. Yahweh is not just another figure among many. It does not appear. He reveals himself. He does not require human sacrifices, does not feed on fear, does not manipulate with vanity. He is the I Am, the one who exists for himself, the one who created everything, the one who is light, justice, truth. The difference between Yahweh and the others is total, but what enemies of the truth did was shuffle the pieces on the tray of the story. They put Yahweh side by side with entities such as Enlil, Enki, Marduk, Baal, Osiris, and so many others. They created malicious, unfounded comparisons, based on fragments of reports that confuse more than they clarify. This equation is strategic, because if Yahweh is reduced to another ancient god, then the sense of absolute reverence, of total surrender, of unique communion, is lost. And that is what the enemy wants. Destabilize faith, undermine the identity of the Creator, make everything seem relative and that no one is sure of anything. But the Bible has always been clear to those who have spiritual eyes. From the beginning, there is a dividing line. The gods of the nations are called false. Their practices are condemned. Their cults are described as abominations. The prophets rose with the courage to denounce pagan altars, mixed rituals, spiritual alliances with entities that offered what Yahweh never authorized. And even today, this confusion continues. How many modern doctrines try to mix the Creator with universal forces? How many philosophies speak of a cosmic consciousness, that everything is, all form, all rules, excluding Yahweh's personality, character, and specific purpose? This is the echo of the same, misleading plan as ancient times. Yahweh, however, does not change. He does not dilute. He remains the same, calling his own back, calling his people to discern, separate, sanctify themselves. This discernment is vital, because when we start studying the Anunnaki, the apocryphal texts, the Sumerian accounts, and all the other sources surrounding this mystery, we risk confusing the pieces. But those who are aligned with the Word, who seeks in the Spirit and in truth, understands there is a throne that does not shake. There is a glory that does not depend on human recognition. There is a name that is above all names, and that name is Yahweh. All the Anunnaki wanted, all the vigilantes wanted, was to occupy this place, steal this glory, be worshipped, feared, revered. But Yahweh made it clear from the beginning, He does not divide His glory with anyone, and therefore those who tried to exalt themselves were tried, those who deceived were thrown away, and those who still try to confuse the children of light today, they will also have their time told. And that's why we need to talk about it. We need to expose the truth, separate the sacred from the profane, to recognize the majesty of the true God in the noise of the voices that cry out for worship. Because understanding who Yahweh is in the midst of all this is the first step to understanding who we are. What is our identity? What is our mission? What is the way back? It is not about religion, it's about truth. And she is crying out to be heard. If you felt something strong listening to this, if any chips fell inside, write in the comments, Yahweh is unique, or say what you thought before about this mixture between the God of the Bible and the ancient gods. Have you been confused by this narrative? Have you ever felt that they were trying to lower the Creator to a common level? Your comment can help other people open their eyes. And if you haven't signed up yet, do it now. Like, share this video and continue with me, because what we will reveal below exposes behind the scenes of a spiritual war that is still in progress. If there is a question that haunts the seekers of the truth, this is this. Why did they hide all this from us? Why were the whole generations fed only with fragments of the spiritual history of humanity, while the most revealing records were banned, burned, or labeled as heresy? What was in these texts that made them so dangerous that they deserve absolute silence? The answer, though, uncomfortable, becomes increasingly evident when we join all the pieces. There is a deep spiritual conspiracy, devised by religious and political systems that have always knew that knowledge frees, and that a free, awake, and spiritually connected people do not easily submit to control. From the beginning, faith has always been a powerful force, and where there is power, there is interest. The empires knew that controlling religious discourse was to control the masses. Governments, institutionalized churches, and spiritual authorities have come together, at different times in history, to define what the people could or could not know. And that's when the cuts, the additions, the forced reinterpretations began. Many of the texts that we today classify as apocryphal or forbidden books were not excluded by containing lies. On the contrary, they were excluded precisely because they revealed too much, because they dismantled power structures, because they pointed to a direct relationship between man and the Creator, without intermediaries, without dependence on institutions, without imposed rituals. The most stark example is the Book of Enoch, which revealed names, strategies, behind the scenes of the spiritual rebellion, and directly connected the angels fallen to the giants, the vigilantes, and the forbidden teachings. Other texts, such as the Gnostic Gospels and the Dead Sea manuscripts, presented worldviews that placed the spirit as the center of the connection with the Most High, not the hierarchy, not the priestly caste, not the physical temples. And that, for the controllers of faith, was a real danger, because a people who understand that the presence of God is not attached to a construction, a system, or a religious leader. It is a people who do not bend in the face of fear or oppression. And here comes the darkest point of this conspiracy. They not only hid, they manipulated. They rewritten parts, omitted contexts, translated conveniently. The process of canonization of biblical books, for example, involved councils led by men with specific political and religious interests. Many of these men did not even understand the spiritual totality of the texts they evaluated. They decided what was inspired and what was false based on human criteria. Meanwhile, books that could open people's eyes to the true spiritual battle that has been hanging since ancient times have been left out, and more. They were labeled as dangerous, as satanic, as liars. And that generated a deep wound in the history of humanity, because the following generations grew up believing that they had the complete truth in their hands, when they actually had only one fraction, a filtered summary. The doctrine has become more important than spiritual experience. The institution placed itself in the place of the spirit. Tradition erased the fire from personal revelation, and the result of this is a disconnected, lost humanity thirsty for something you feel like but can't name it. This something is the truth, the complete truth, the one that was suffocated by the centuries of silence and fear, the one that says you have access to the Creator directly without needing human structures that tell you what to think, what to feel, or what to believe. And of course, this manipulation did not just come from religions. Political systems also realized the power in spiritual control. They used faith as a war, domain, exploration tool. From ancient empires to modern governments, sacred discourse was used as a shield to justify terrible actions. Crusades, inquisitions, colonizations, slavery, all done in the name of God. But God was never in these dirty pacts. Yahweh's name was used, but his character was ignored. And all this was only possible because the original truth had been suppressed. Now, think to me, what if everyone had had access to the full texts? What if each person, instead of being trained to obey dogmas, were taught to develop spiritual discernment, to hear the voice of the Spirit, to dive into the mysteries revealed with responsibility and faith? The world would be completely different. Faith would not be an instrument of fear, but a bridge live with the Creator. Spirituality would not be a product, but an intimate, true, transformative journey. But this future will only be possible if we excavate the past again, if we reopen the hidden files, if we have the courage to ask, why did they hide this? Who benefits from our ignorance? And what is still being hidden today? Yes, because the control is not over. The manipulation continues. Censorship is now digital, algorithmic, strategic. Videos like this are silenced. Channels are knocked down. Voices are ridiculed. But the more they hide, the more they grow the thirst to know. And the more they try to shut up, the more voices get up with courage. You may be feeling this now. An awakening, a restlessness, a feeling that all that you are listening makes more sense than many empty preaching you've heard around. You may have already felt at some point in your life that you have deceived you, who hid something from you. If this is your case, write in the comments now, I want the complete truth. Also, share what you feel when you realize that much of what was taught was just part of the story. Have you suspected it before? You already realized that there was something wrong, but I didn't know exactly what. Right. Your comment can awaken other people. And if you haven't left the like yet, leave it now. If you haven't signed up, subscribe. And continue with me, because the next revelation will directly confront what many believe is the end. But it may only be the beginning of the true spiritual history of humanity. If you have gotten here, something inside you has started to change. You may not yet know exactly what it is, but you feel, deep down, that some spiritual key turned, that a curtain was pulled, that the way you saw faith, the Bible, the history, and even the spirit world will no longer be SMA. And that's exactly why this journey we're doing together is not just a historical or theological curiosity. but a turn of consciousness. The question that arises now, more strongly than ever, is simple but deep. How does all this change your faith? The answer begins when you understand that knowing the truth about the Creator and the false gods is not a theological detail. It is a watershed in your spiritual life. Because when you find out that much of what you taught you was a cut, an adjusted and manipulated version, and that the true spiritual history of humanity was suffocated by human, religious, and political interests, you can no longer continue to live a superficial faith. There is no way to go to the same places, listen to the same messages, repeat the same automatic prayers, as if all were well. It is not, and it was never, because true faith begins when the veil is torn, and you face spiritual reality with maturity, courage, and thirst for purity. This transformation does not happen overnight. It starts when you look inside and realize that your faith needs to be clean, restored, refined by the fire of truth, not a blind faith, based only on tradition, but a living faith based on spiritual discernment, the direct revelation of the Spirit, the intimate connection with Yahweh, the true Creator. Because now you know, there are entities that disguise you, who feed on spiritual ignorance, who have taken control of religious systems, which have shaped doctrines to keep the sleeping people. They were called gods, but they were false. Anunnaki, vigilantes, fallen beings, mixed with the sacred, and all this was placed before our eyes as normal, as acceptable, as part of the walk of faith. But it is not. If you have arrived here, you may have realized that this journey is not just about old knowledge, lost civilizations, or forbidden texts. What is at stake is much deeper, intimate, and urgent. Your faith, your spiritual identity, and your direct connection with the true Creator. What we are unleashing together is not a historical curiosity. It is a revelation that has the power to break the mental and spiritual currents that were placed on whole generations. Because when you understand that you have been fed with manipulated fragments of truth, that you have given you a molded religious system to maintain control and not to awaken the spirit, so you can no longer just go back. The veil fell. And now comes the most important question. What are you going to do with it? Knowing all this, recognizing that there was a spiritual conspiracy to hide what is sacred, to realize that there were beings who presented themselves as gods, when they were actually spiritual rebels trying to steal the glory of Yahweh, that changes everything. It changes the way you read the Bible. It changes the way you pray. It changes the way you see temples, the pulpits, the symbols. You start to understand that much of what they called faith was in fact tradition, that much of what they called doctrine was in fact control, that much of what they called God's will was only the desire of men trying to speak for Him. And when this light lights inside you, there is no return. You start to question everything, not by rebellion but by discernment, because the Spirit of truth begins to move within you, and you feel that there is something bigger calling you back to the origin. This origin is not a system. It is not a religion. It is not a title, a position, a church sign. The origin is Yahweh, the Creator who does not need to be defended, but wants to be known. He who revealed Himself to the simple, the broken, those who have the courage to get out of the flock and ask, but why did they hide it? Because the truth frees it, but before free, she confronts. And this is where many retreat, because it is more comfortable living on family lie than facing the truth. It transforms. Only now you know. I've seen too much to pretend nothing happened. I've heard too much to stay in silence. And this revelation needs to generate response, a change, a turn. Because it is not enough to know that there were Anunnaki, that there was a spiritual rebellion, which the vigilantes transgressed, that the books were removed. This only makes sense to cause a new positioning within you. If you take you back to what is pure, simple, straightforward, the presence of the true God. The Bible says, "You will know the truth and the truth will set you free." But it also warns that in recent days there would be such a well-designed mistake that if it were possible, it would deceive even the chosen ones. This means that the system of lies around us is not only human, it is spiritual, it is strategic, it is millennial. And to overcome it, we need open spiritual eyes, sharp sensitivity, courage, and obedience to the Holy Spirit. And Agore, after all this, is the big final question. A question that needs hammering inside you because it is more than a hook. It is a portal. If the Anunnaki really walked among men and were confused with gods, if the vigilantes taught what they should not, and if the spiritual leaders hid the evidence, then what did you hide the most from you? What other truths are still buried, locked in coffers, classified as myths, ridiculed by the gym, or by institutionalized religion? What else did you accept as normal, just because they told you it was like this? Is what you call reality still in fact reality? Or is it a carefully assembled scenario to prevent you from seeing what is really happening behind the scenes of the physical and spiritual world? Who decides what you can or cannot know? Who created the official versions that taught you? Who has decided what is too dangerous for you to know? And why is there so much resistance, so much hatred, so much attack as someone dares to ask these questions? These questions are dangerous not because they lead to destruction, but because they open the doors to freedom. And spiritual freedom, for those who live in manipulation, is unbearable. That's why they try to drown out, discredit, censor, silence. But you are here, and this is already a sign that the Spirit is awakening yours. It is separating those who want more than rituals, who want more than ready-made sermons. May they long for a true reconnection with the Creator, not with the false gods, not with the ancient mistakes, but with Yahweh, the only worthy. So answer me in the comments. What did you hide most from us? Write this phrase if you felt this impact on the Spirit. Share what touched you in this video. What a moment you woke you up. Have you ever thought about it? Have you ever had any spiritual experience that would make you question the religious system? Your comment is not just an outburst. It may be the spark that arouses others. If you stayed here, it's because something inside you are awakening. And that's not a coincidence, so I want to invite you to be part of a search community of the truth. Subscribe now to the channel, activates the bell of notifications, because here we will continue to reveal what many are still trying to hide. If you arrived until the end, comment below. I see beyond the veil. This phrase will show that you are part of those who are not content with half validity and are ready to see what is behind the official history. Also, don't forget to leave the like. It helps this video a lot to reach more people who are looking for exactly what you found here. And now, watch the next video that is appearing on the left side of your screen. He will take you even deeper into this mystery and show you that what we saw today is just the beginning. Go there. I find you in the next awakening.